Welcome back, everyone. I'm had the pleasure to introduce our speaker for our policy update. It's Mike Wilson with CostQuest. I know the folks at CostQuest are very busy these days, so it was we were very fortunate and happy and proud to have Mike be able to spare some time and give us an update on what's going on in DC and elsewhere. So without any further introduction to do, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Larry. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and hear some familiar voices. I'd rather be in Austin than here in cold Seattle, but we will take this and we'll do it remotely. Larry talked about a policy update. Really, it's mostly about funding and the policy that brought about that funding and a little bit about what that means. There's so much to talk about there, and I will probably have 40 minutes worth of talking, but I want to open that up for questions as well for 10, 15 minutes at least. I'm going to share a presentation now, so bear with me for a minute. All right. So I'm assuming everybody can see the presentation. Government funding influences. So just bear with me a second. Okay. So the topics here include just getting, I know a lot of you have an understanding, a broad understanding of what's coming down the pike in terms of funding, especially as it relates to the infrastructure bill. But we're going to get get into a deeper dive on that. Talking about pushing expansion of fiber for broadband, getting out into the rural areas, focusing on middle mile is a big focus of a lot of the funding programs. What parts of it are stimulus versus what's long-term? Supply demand programs, we'll talk a little bit about those. What's served and unserved, how do we define those? But really also kind of gives you an idea of the changing competitive landscape. So, I mean, we talked about, I know Steve at T-Mobile talked about competition. This will probably highlight some of that more clearly for a lot of you. So government funding overall, just the very big picture, money everywhere. There's more funding now than there ever has been. On top of universal service funding, which is now obviously under the Connect America Fund and the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, there's all kinds of other programs out there. Some legacy, like BTOP, BIP, still, tails of that. It's pretty much expended. Connect America Fund is, we typically haven't seen it under the Connect America model and ACAM. And then, as always, we still have our U.S. loans and grants. There is mobility funding, right, that has already gone out. Some more will go out. There's funding still being expended in places like New York, the $500 million program that they have. And then there's, again, back to USDA, Rural Utility Service Reconnect Program, and then opportunity zones related to tax incentives. There's also kind of getting into the more current things, the EBB program for low income, CAF2, which is still rolling out, RDOF 1 still rolling out. The CARES, so the next funds are COVID, coronavirus related funds, right? The CARES Act, ARPA, et cetera. And then we'll get into kind of a little bit of a deeper dive into the infrastructure bill and what's coming down the pike for that. And then RDOF 2, which there's still quite a bit of money down to be spent for RDOF, and then a 5G fund. So federal funding, as we see it, is a generational, once in a generation opportunity, right? We're looking at well more than $100 billion opportunity over the next few years. with tails of spending over the next 10. Just to understand the order of magnitude, and I'll share more on this, affordability subsidies are somewhere between $10 and $30 billion, depending on how they're expended. Digital literacy and adoption, 3 to 5 billion. And then deployments, the bulk of it, we'll talk in depth about the deployment, between 70 billion and $100 billion. There is, by design and by law, a major role for states. And that's going to be interesting to see how states, there's a lot of leverage for the states to pull on their sides as well. Looking a little bit more closely at the actual funds, the amounts and timing, the BIP program, which is rolling out now under NTIA, and the tribal broadband grants, all going on right now. Most of those applications for funding have already closed. There's still more that needs to be submitted for that, but those are the current NTIA programs. USDA has to reconnect upcoming phases, $2 to $5 billion going out this year, $2 billion going out this year. Then there's the Treasury programs, right? There's both a middle mile and a last mile component. And there's the state and local program, and then the capital projects fund. Again, a huge opportunity there in and of itself without the infrastructure bill. Between 5 and 15 billion for last mile and 5 and 10 for middle mile. Then there is the infrastructure bill. More than, I think it's about 42.5 billion just in infrastructure rollout. And it's all 50 states and territories. There's a lot more to talk about that, and we'll go into that. RDOF Phase 2 is still out there. No final rulemaking for the actual program, but that is coming up, and there is still a fund for 5G rollout. So the estimated total, again, 70 to $100 billion. No one's seen anything like this before. Just a quick visual on time frame, right? So some of these programs tail into 10 years of expenditures and roll out a little bit more slowly. Some of it is more stimulus focused and get out sooner, but really they're all going to be rolling out now through 2024. So really kind of, if you're planning, you're looking at where we are with the baseline with our current funds, strategic planning and scaling up for these new funds, and then states kind of start taking over and guiding the programs and implementing the programs for first phase, second phase, whether it's Treasury and NTIA or in the future for FCC work. Again, it's hard to put in words how much money this is. This is just really more stylistic, but it gives you an idea since 2009 through 2031 as we look kind of at the tail of how we're expending these funds. This is in billions of dollars on an annual basis. We haven't seen anything like that. And so when you think about the largesse of what we thought was a pretty big program on BTOP and BIP back in 2009, 2010, you know, that was $4 billion. We're looking at programs much larger and could have a very big impact. If we look at it on the map basis, and you know, CostQuest, this is part of what we do, is broadband mapping. Here's our local, our most recent look at fiber to the prem investment requirements across the U.S. In red, that darker area, that's more investment per location, and then getting into the green, it's less investment per location. The gray are areas not needing funding, either covered, served, or you know, waterways and national parks, etc. There's a lot of land area, and there are a lot of locations out there that need to be served. One thing that NTIA is going to be working on is how to allocate funding across states and jurisdictions. They've done some of that already, and we'll get into that. But here is a look at needed investment for fiber by state. Texas clearly up top there, with Missouri, Illinois, California pretty close behind. This gives you the look at all the funding programs, right? So the amounts, the timing, et cetera. I was describing that, I'm sure doing a great job, but this visual is certainly going to be helpful. Right, so again, the estimated total of these funds, 70 to 100 billion in infrastructure grant funding over the next few years. Moving to slide 7, and I'll just check one more time that you can see slide 7, Helen. Okay, cool. And this is a visual that was probably pretty important a few minutes ago, but going from 2020's baseline to 2024, when all of these funding programs are supposed to roll out, you see what needs to be done, right? We've got a lot of programs related to the coronavirus pandemic going out right now. We've got more funding coming out with NTIA, Treasury's rolling theirs out, and then in the future we've got more FCC funding, such as RDOF 2 and mobility funding. So that's in the later years. When we talk about that historical opportunity at a generational, once in a generation investment, you think about, again, going back to BTOP and BIP, back during the last recovery, the ARRA, that $4 billion through BTOP pales in comparison to what's going out, coming up now and coming up. So looking at these numbers in billions, again, the opportunity can't be overstated. Here's the map. And again, this is investment for fiber to the prem by location. So looking again at the red is where higher investment is needed on a per location basis, green less on a per location basis, and gray doesn't need any funding. And here's that graph on investment by state, right? Again, fiber to the prem on a per location basis, total investment needed to close the divide, at least on the supply side. Texas, again, clearly $6.5 billion in order to get FTTP everywhere. A little bit on historical, how I think this is important as a setup to see how things are going to change in the competitive world in the broadband industry and the ecosystem going forward. And that is looking at last 2 incentive auctions, how those funds went out, right? And this is on an annual basis. This funding is on an annual basis. If you look at the CAF2 reverse auction and how that rolled out, it was maybe a little bit different than expected when it first was being talked about. The competition came for that incentive program from competitive carriers, and mostly fixed wireless carriers. You look at a company like Whisper ISP in Missouri, winning $22 million a year, mostly for Missouri, but also other places. Then you look at Viasat, a satellite company, winning $12 million a year. Those things happened and took some people by surprise, and then more of it happened, a little bit more of it happened in RDOF. And just for explanation, when we're looking at these numbers, those federally funded programs through the FCC used an incentive auction, and the bids were weighted by performance tier on speed and latency. And our numbers are drawn out by that. On RDOF, look at how that rolled out. LTD Broadband, I believe Texas-based WISP, with with some fiber as well. CCO Holdings, Charter, and then look at SpaceX, Starlink, right? Winning over $1 billion in total funding. This is a bit of a shakeup, right? So how is this going to look going forward? It's hard to say, but most of the programs coming out in the next few years are not reverse auctions incentive programs. RDOF is a mobility fund, will be, but a lot of these are grants, and they're going to be administered by states. So it may be a little bit different. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of these programs coming up. The EBB, just a little bit on opportunity zones because it's impactful. RDOF, Consolidated Appropriations, American Rescue, RDOF 5.2, 5G and infrastructure. So the emergency broadband benefit was from the Consolidated Appropriations Act from last year, allocated $3.2 billion for basically consumers with low income demand side issues, right? And so most of those who took this offering were given up to $50 a month credit toward broadband service. And there was some funding also for equipment. And a lot of this was really focused on getting broadband devices out to people to support them during the pandemic for things like remote health, remote learning, et cetera, et cetera. By my last check, I think by year end, there were 3 million people who took this service. The EBB benefit program had requirements, right? A lot of it based on income metrics, but really it's a lot like the low income program, where it's based on where you in Medicaid, food stamps, some of those other programs, Pell Grants, that qualified you for some of these subsidies. Another mention of a program that is impactful, qualified opportunity zones. These came out of legislation in 2017 to define areas where you could get tax benefits for a number of things, including build out of broadband. And here's a map of those qualified opportunity zones across the US. So going into RDOF, it's interesting to see who won and who didn't. One would have expected more play from fiber, and there was. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Charter certainly won a lot of areas and kind of disparate geographies as well. So 99% of locations offered were awarded. Participants bid the support down to 40% of the reserve offered. That was a pretty good, efficient spend of money. Charter was the biggest winner. SpaceX, using the low Earth orbit satellites under Starlink, was the second biggest winner. That's notable. In California, 600 of the 700 million went to fixed wireless providers. So those are some pretty big learnings that states and the federal government took from this. And kind of put a mark in this, a pin in this, and note that not all states liked how this rolled out. Not all entities liked how this rolled out. And states do have an opportunity with the upcoming BEAD program and other programs to kind of guide how their funding is spent. And I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Consolidated Appropriations Act, $1.9 billion. These were grants available for providers to, a lot of it was relating to ripping Huawei materials out of their plants and replacing it. A lot of money went out for that and is still going out on that right now. You would have had to submit applications already, and it's closed for that, but funding is going out now. The ARPA fund, the American Rescue Plan, $10 billion. Again, this is a mostly a capital projects fund related to coronavirus. And I know a lot of states and entities have put in for this. So this is for expanding broadband directly to enable work, education, health monitoring, and remote work options for those impacted by the pandemic, which is all of us. A minimum of $100 million per state is going out, and $100 million for each U.S. territory. And then there's $100 million to be split equally between tribal governments and state of Hawaii. The next programs, well, I'll talk briefly about this, but these have long since sailed. But here's for the Capital Projects Fund, the applications or requesting funding were due for a lot of these already, unless you're a tribal government. You have till June 1st, 2022. So RDOF Phase 2, this is the residual of what's left from the RDOF, roughly $20 billion in RDOF. There's $11.2 billion left. You have to be an eligible telecommunications carrier certified by a state utilities commission usually to receive these fundings. It's administered by the FCC. Final rules aren't out for this yet, and there's no final details on applications, but we expect this to roll out in the next year and a half or 2 years. A lot of it is hinging on the FCC getting up their broadband data collection program first, and I'll hit that at the end of the presentation. There's also the 5G fund that has been talked about. Initial rules have been put out for comment on a couple of occasions. This has been talked about for a long time, but it's still probably going to be something that goes out a little bit later, sometime around the same time as RDOF 2. And they are waiting for the broadband data collection effort to resolve itself before they expend funds for mobility in rural areas. And I should note that CostQuest, if you know us, we do a lot of cost modeling efforts nationwide. One recent one we did going back to 5G and mobility is we estimated the Competitive Carrier Association commissioned a study for us to look at how much it would cost to roll out 5G nationwide. And it's anywhere from 25 billion to 55 billion, depending on how you design it and how many roads you hit and what you're assuming is the baseline of what's served and unserved today. But at bare minimum, it's 25 billion to get 5G and ubiquity across the US. So here's the big one. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as part of the infrastructure bill that there's been lots of talk about for more than a decade and finally passed and got signed into law. There is $42.5 billion available in rural areas to eligible entities. And these are grants. And I guess look at it as block grants. These are block grants that go out to states and jurisdictions to be spent with the rules set forth in the Act, but also as defined by NTIA. $100 million base will be allocated to each state, and 33 billion remaining will be based on unserved locations by state. They don't have that. They have not resolved that. There's a lot of talk about that, but until that's resolved, most of this funding has not been, it's not been determined where it's going to be put. So we'll get to that because a lot of this, the BEAD program, especially within the IIJA, is going to rely on good location data, good broadband mapping, so that we don't make the mistakes of the past, BTOP, BIP, other programs where we're spending billions of dollars but don't exactly know what's served and unserved, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Tribal connectivity, $2 billion in tribal government or college or university, Hawaiian homelands, they're all eligible for this. And that's going out right now as well. There is a $1 billion set aside for enabling middle mile broadband infrastructure. I'm going to talk about, I mean, this seems like a small amount. There's more middle mile funding as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of timing and coordinating of these funding programs and looking at middle mile first. And one place to look who's kind of gotten out ahead of this, I guess they really out of the gates first, and at least getting a strategy for leveraging the federal funds along with their state funds to build a program that is coordinated with federal funding opportunities and timed well. So California has approved a bill to build out, essentially spend $7 billion on broadband networks. First with a state middle mile network, $3.25 billion. There's a lot of money for a single state to build out middle mile networks. It would be a statewide open access middle mile managed by a nonprofit third party. This is big. This is different. It includes provisions to streamline state contracting laws and permitting for getting this middle mile built. I'd be remiss to say that this fund and all the funds that I'm talking about, there is a risk from equipment being back ordered to labor shortages to getting all these materials to the site locations. There's a risk there that these won't go out as quickly as we all want them to. But I thought I'd just, not to dampen the mood, but that is a real risk here. Also, California is rolling out $4 billion in funds for last mile grants, and then a federal funding account that they've set up. And then basically rolling out the middle mile first and then expending funds on last mile next. And that's a way that they can use their state funding, leverage that first so that when bidders go to bid or grant applicants go to bid on these locations, the middle mile is already built, and so that there's an efficiency of spend for the last mile programs. So very forward-thinking approach. And then they've also set up a local broadband loan loss reserve fund. This will help local governments issue bonds. It'll take away a lot of the risk. It'll help them on terms with bond issues. Sorry. So this is another thing that's relatively new. It's not that it hasn't been done before, but probably not at this scale. So that's an overview of the funds. Again, historic opportunity here, but we our CostQuest is working directly with the federal government, working with states in making sure that these funds are targeted well, spent efficiently. And so kind of what I mentioned before about not making the mistakes of the past, I want to talk a little bit about that now. And that is getting a very good look at actually what's served and unserved across the US and what that looks like going forward. So can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, sorry, my screen's frozen, so you're all looking like statues. So broadband mapping is critical. I know it's kind of an obscure topic, but I want to make sure that everybody understands that until broadband mapping gets improved or has improved, spending this level of funding in rural America could be wasted. I had an old CEO at an old company I worked with, Western Wireless, actually McCaw Communications first. He said, if we don't have data, if we have data, let's look at the data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. A lot of what has been funded in the US has just been based on that, right? Opinions, where funding should be spent without having good data. And so I really quickly want to go through the history of how data impacts how we spend public funds, right? When I started looking at broadband mapping was when I joined CostQuest back in 2006. And at that time, the best that was being done was broadband mapping at the census tract level. Census tracts are very large geographies. They can have as many as 8,000 people, and they're huge. Basically, you could have a county with 3 or 4 census tracts, right? Over time, we've gotten better at broadband mapping. We've gotten down to the census block. The census block level gives you a little bit more accuracy, but the way our program is set up with the FCC's Form 477 data collection program is that if we are seeing a submission from carriers that show that they're serving one location in a census block, it's deemed that that entire census block is served by broadband. So that leaves a lot of areas unserved or seen as served, but are actually unserved. Over time, we've gotten better. We've gotten down to the census block level, but now via the Broadband Data Act, the federal government is required to spend its funding and do its broadband mapping at the structure level. So basically what we've developed at CostQuest and what the FCC has engaged us on with a recent award back in November is the broadband serviceable location data set. This allows you to see broadband service availability at a structure location. And when I say structure, I mean structures that are where people live and work. So I'm going to skip over some slides here and get to the basics of it. The fabric is basically a comprehensive data set that gives us each single point defined as a structure location that could have or needs broadband service. It's basically identifying structures by looking at things like parcel boundaries and parcel attributes, tax assessor data, and then building footprint data to understand what those buildings are. Are they residences, houses, and businesses, or are they chicken coops, barns, grain silos, and other things? So we've worked hard at CostQuest to build this data set, and the federal government will be using this going forward. As you can see, we define these structures that need to be served. And if you look at it on a map basis, you can see that those locations that we define as fabric locations, broadband serviceable locations, in those blue census blocks, it's showing that they're served by the FCC's definition, but the red dots within those blue areas, those dark blue areas, are actually unserved. So that kind of gives you a look at how this kind of old regime of broadband mapping can yield some pretty bad results in terms of defining what's served and unserved. So before a lot of this funding can go out, they need this fabric data. Then they're going to go through a broadband data collection where they match all the provider data with our broadband fabric data to show what's served and unserved over time. This is going to give states and the federal government a little closer look at what needs to be targeted for funding and what does not need to be targeted for funding. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions about the funding programs, about targeting of funding, et cetera.
I had a real quick question for you, Mike. If I recall, the earlier federal funding for broadband was sort of technology agnostic. that it was basically dependent on providing a certain level of bandwidth per subscriber. Is there, in the newer funding programs, is there any preference, say, toward fiber as opposed to other things, or is it still technology agnostic?
Yeah, so I mean, technically speaking, it is technology agnostic. However, the programs, as we look at the IIJA and the BEAD programs, they give a lot of leeway and discretion to the states on that. Not necessarily on technology, but on speed, right? So, you know, if a state has preference for 100 megabits or more, and they have to, you know, they can kind of model their funding to preference maybe fiber or something like that. It is still, the short answer, Larry, is it is still technology neutral. And just to give a little bit more color to it, right? Broadband as defined as unserved is 25.3 for these upcoming programs. But the funds are going to be expended for providers who are serving at 100 megabits by 20. So just so you understand how that is defined. Another provision is somewhat unrelated to your question, Larry, is up to 20% of those locations don't have to be unserved. So you can actually fold in locations and submit grant applications to areas that actually have competition already there, an incumbent there. So that gets back to Steve's question from the last presentation. So hopefully that answers your question. Still technology neutral.
Could you, you mentioned that the SpaceX and Starlink had won some of the RDOF money. I guess they were the victors in one, and then up there in another. Are they expected to stay active, and should expect them getting lots of funding? And what do you think of all that?
Yeah, no, I think so. Given that they essentially were awarded $1 billion, really without having the incremental costs and spend that they would have had anyway, except to support additional demand, right? If you look at, I don't want to characterize it as this, but if you look at that as free money, there's nothing stopping them from going after other funds, provided they allow with kind of the performance tier, especially on the latency part, to perform in incentive auctions for RDOF 2, or support them going after funding at the state level for the 33 to 42.5 billion that's going to be spent in the states. So I don't have the inside scoop on that, Larry, but I can't imagine that they'd just kind of sit back and watch, given how they performed in the last auction.
Okay. I have one follow-up question, or maybe not a follow-up question, a different question. Maybe you have to do this in your head, I don't know, but given the latest infrastructure bill money and everything else, will there be enough money to build fiber out to everyone that doesn't have it, or doesn't have a, say at least 100 megabits per second capability? Or are we still going to be short? Assuming that
technically speaking, from our modeling that we've done to support the lawmaking that went on, yeah, technically that we get pretty close to closing the gap with fiber with that amount of money. Maybe fall a little bit short, but very, very close. Right. So I don't know. I know my colleague Mark is on and may want to hit me from answering that at all, but maybe he also has something to add.
I was just going to appreciate that you took it, Mike, and I didn't. So, I mean, the United States and its territories are really, really big. Alaska is enormous. You've got areas in the Pacific Ocean that have to get covered by that. So there's a lot out there to say everybody.
Yeah. Other questions?
Going back to the middle mile topic you talked about, and you said that was going to be in California, at least operated by a nonprofit.
Yeah,
And so
a third party, non-governmental organization.
Wonder how that's going to be taxed. Anyway, just curious.
They'll probably find a way.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions or discussion points for Mike? Cool. Well, thank you, Mike. That was extremely informative, and thanks for taking time to join us and give us that readout. Sounds like we're definitely looking for some exciting years ahead in terms of the underserved part of the world, and very much appreciate your time.
As always, we appreciate all of the folks at TFI, and we're happy to contribute where we can, and we can't wait to see you in person next year.
Excellent. Yeah, we can't either. And thanks again, CostQuest, for your sponsorship of the of our program. It means a lot.
Thank you.